Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings from 1978, which was directed by Ralph Bakshi. This is my series where every week before a new Hobbit movie comes out, because there are 3 animated Tolkien films, there are 3 Lord of the Rings films, and now there are going to be 3 Hobbit films. I thought every time, since last time I did the first animated Tolkien film, which was The Hobbit, and the first Lord of the Rings film, which was Fellowship of the Ring. Now, since we have the second Hobbit film, I thought I'd do the second released J.R.R. Tolkien animated film, which was Lord of the Rings. This is an adaptation of pretty much the first 2 books, The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. It does not include The Return of the King, and it's obviously not as extensive as Peter Jackson's films because it's only 130 minutes, so you could probably watch this like twice in the time it takes you to watch just the first one. So they obviously had to cut a lot of stuff out, quite a lot of stuff out when you think there are extended editions of those films, and this is pretty much it. Ralph Bakshi, when viewing this film, I always am a little sympathetic towards him because I think he really actually tried. He wanted this film to be called The Lord of the Rings Part 1, but the producers of the film were kind of game for it while at the beginning of production, but as it was going on, they felt no one would see a film that was just part 1 of something. Little did they know, Bakshi had prepared this film as a part 1. He didn't get to prepare a part 2. Bringing up that it doesn't include Return of the King, I think is unfair because it never intended to do that, but because it doesn't have part 1, there is a kind of annoyance from the audience because you're like, well, you said The Lord of the Rings, man. I mean, this isn't The Lord of the Rings. This is just 2/3 of The Lord of the Rings. I kind of feel for Bakshi because he really tried to stay loyal to the Tolkien material, as loyal as you can be in 130 minutes. He tried to make it work. I think it was very ambitious, probably too ambitious. It works and it doesn't work, and I guess I'm probably being nicer to this film than maybe I even should be because I grew up watching this film a lot. In fact, there was one summer in the mid-90s where I had rented this film. I think it was from my local mom and pop video store, and I got kind of obsessed with it for whatever reason. I think because it was a PG animated film that had violence in it, and my options for films with violence, since I had ratings conservative parents, were very limited. I kind of got everyone in the neighborhood into it, or at least they followed my lead and we all played Lord of the Rings. So I kind of have a bit of nostalgia for this film, despite it not being the greatest adaptation. At the time I had only read The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings felt daunting, and to be honest, I've never read them. But since I know the story more through Peter Jackson's films, this film feels more glaring than it did then. And it does have major storytelling problems, which is a shame for a set of books that are known for their grand storytelling and how imaginative they are. Bakshi got that this film needs to focus on Frodo, Sam, Gandalf, and Aragorn, and those characters come out really well. You're following pretty much Frodo. Aragorn is probably the least developed of them, and Legolas and Gimli are kind of forgettable. I remember when we played Lord of the Rings, I had to keep asking my dad who those other characters' names were because they're so kind of infrequent in the film. Gollum is also in it. I remember my brother used to play Gollum a lot. He was like really into Gollum for whatever reason. This film doesn't really develop the villain part very well, and the villain's design, the ring wraith's design, are just very black and murky. They look like you're trying to Xerox a really complicated drawing and it just comes out like bleh. He used rotoscope quite a bit in this, and I actually like his rotoscope in things like Fire and Ice, but in this film it just doesn't look that great. Fire and Ice is a better example of his style than this is. It feels like he's restrained, he's kind of held down by taking on all this material. But the villains just aren't in it as much, so you understand they're on a quest, but you don't get a full grasp of the villain and what they're fighting against. So there's really not a real good and evil story. It's just more of an adventure story, and it's more about Frodo and Aragorn and Gandalf. And Aragorn, by the way, who's voiced by John Hurt. Legolas is actually voiced by Anthony Daniels of C-3PO fame. He's smart in that he understands what to focus on in certain parts of the story, but it's just like too much of a daunting story to really break down into such simplistic terms. And since he's trying to include things and trying to also be faithful, a lot of it doesn't work. And a major criticism of the 1978 Lord of the Rings is that you'd have to have read the book to understand what's going on. At the time when I was a kid, I do remember asking my dad, who is a big Tolkien fan, a million questions about what was going on. And part of me kind of feels like the reason I understood it this time, and I hadn't seen it in a long time, I actually hadn't seen it since Peter Jackson's films came out, is mainly because I'm familiar with the material. I think if you came into this without knowing it, Lord of the Rings, it really relies on the fact that you have a familiarity with the books. And this book was really popular. It was the 70s, you know, Led Zeppelin loved Lord of the Rings. Every pot-smoking, fantasy-loving, heavy metal reading kid probably had a copy of these books, and so they could kind of follow along, but it wasn't going to win new fans over. A common thing is that this film was such a failure, someone else could come along and make The Lord of the Rings and make this film instantly forgotten. Critically, it was kind of a disaster, but financially it did pretty well. It was bigger than Fritz the Cat was in this country. There's no foreign box office for this one, unfortunately, but I think Fritz the Cat worldwide made more. But this was a decent hit for Bakshi, actually, and I think it kind of broke a little more mainstream. And this was a time when you could have kind of stoner adult animated films in wider release than actually we do now, which is interesting that in the late 70s you had like things like Wizards and American Pop and Heavy Metal, which isn't a Bakshi film but looks kind of like a Bakshi film, and Fritz the Cat. I don't think you could make adult animated films on this scale, the scale that Bakshi did now, interestingly enough. And I think he probably wanted to prove himself. There was really no like auteur animation directors at the time, or at least to like what he was doing. He loved Tolkien, he wanted to take on someone else's work, and hey, it worked out with Fritz the Cat, right? It's way too hindered down by trying to accomplish way too much. He doesn't make the sacrifices that like Peter Jackson and even the Rankin Bass people made to make it work more as a movie. He's kind of trying to fit all this stuff in, which is something that I think as an adaptation you should always think about. How is this going to work as a movie rather than how can we fit all this crap into the movie. When comic book movies were just starting to come into prominence, look at the Daredevil movie where they put in too much continuity into a movie and it just falls completely flat. And I think Lord of the Rings definitely has that problem. I like that it exists. I like that there's kind of more of the 70s idea of Lord of the Rings. Not that it wasn't popular before then, but I think in the 70s it reached this hippie, weed smoking mythos about itself. Nerds who didn't do any of that, they read it as well, but I think it had that more of that connotation. And you know, with the illustrations that were coming out in heavy metal magazines or fantasy adult magazines, I think it's kind of cool that they got to make one then. And I actually kind of like the animation style in some places. Bakshi's rotoscope style works a lot better when he completely draws over them. He later said it was a total mistake to use rotoscoping as much as he did, but in this he kind of just makes them black and murkier. He doesn't give it kind of a very distinctive quality to it. Apparently even when they made the action figures of this film, they had to kind of completely redesign it for the ring race because you can't really see them. Are they like the weird fog creatures in John Carpenter's The Fog? Are they Jawas? Like, they just don't have a distinct look. They just look like a black mess. And when he draws over someone and does like a really like interesting real animated character over someone's rotoscoping rather than when they used to rotoscope and make them act like cartoons, he just shot people like regular actors. Works a lot better than this murky Xeroxy thing. It really does look like someone made a ditto for you in school and this interesting picture can't be done, so it just looks like a big black mess. You know there's evil, but you kind of like they're not very memorable. Apparently Peter Jackson at first denied ever seeing this film, which is odd, and then it said that this is kind of one of the films that got him into Tolkien, and he references it a couple times in the film, both visually, and there's a couple lines that reference this film also. I don't think this is a good movie. I used to like this more than the Rankin Bass Hobbit film when I was a kid. I felt it was the more complicated movie. It was the more interesting movie. It was the deeper, more adult movie, and I was right about the complicated part because whoa. But now that I watch it, I kind of think Rankin Bass animated film is a lot better of a movie because it's more concerned with telling one story and really understands how to get itself to work within that story. Whereas Bakshi's Lord of the Rings is kind of brought down by the source material because it's just not as focused on trying to tell like this in one movie, basically. I like how he designed everybody and he didn't make them look like incredibly attractive. They look kind of more like ordinary people, which I think gives it kind of a more raw or low budget sense to it. This actually came out like the same month as Watership Down. I'm glad I saw it again because it did not hold up as well as like the animated Hobbit, the Rankin Bass Hobbit film. And I still have a lot of respect for Ralph Bakshi, and I like a lot of his features. I kind of recommend all his other fantasy action films like Wizards and Fire and Ice over this film. I think this is definitely the weakest one. His use of rotoscope has always been kind of questionable, and the fact that he admits he shouldn't have done it as much as he did. But I think this is the worst I've ever seen it, and it really didn't work, and I think it actually ended up hindering the movie quite a bit. But there are really a lot of problems, but it comes down to the fact that Bakshi said he wanted to make this film to save the books for film for Tolkien. And he kind of did, because if you hear about the adaptation John Barrowman was going to make, which was going to be an 100-minute Lord of the Rings movie that was going to cover all 3 books, he definitely stopped that from happening. And he did influence the Lord of the Rings movies. There are some shots in the Lord of the Rings that are right out of this movie. Its influence and what it stopped, it did a great job. But as for the movie itself, I don't really ever want to watch it again. There are definitely sacrifices that need to be made when making a Tolkien film, and it felt like he was ready to make them and also wasn't ready to make them. And in addition to that, I think his ambition got the better of him. There's a lot of problems with Bakshi's direction in this film. It just shows that you really have to be an amazing director to tackle something like this. And I think that's why the Lord of the Rings films are so an awe-inspiring thing, because it's just like, it's a big project to take on, and I think it was maybe a little too ambitious, maybe if this had just been Fellowship of the Ring or something like that. This is a film that really kind of crumbles under its own ambition, and that's a shame, because I think, you know, a Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, if I was around in the 70s and someone said, hey, Ralph Bakshi's making a Lord of the Rings, I would have been excited. I would have been like, oh cool, I like Wizards, this might work. I wish this had kind of worked out for him, but I also wish he had probably directed it a lot better as well. So if you have seen J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings from 1978 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. Later in the week, I will be reviewing The Two Towers and then The Hobbit, The Dissolution of Smaug. And I hope to see you then, and thank you for watching.